Okay, welcome everyone to session 204. My name is William Davis and I'll be serving as the session chair today. Please note this session is being recorded and we will have time for questions at the end, so please drop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, for today we have two very talented presenters for this session. Our first speaker, Brooke LeFevre, will present Schisms Like Revolutions Never Go Backward, the Godbeites and the Anti-Polygamy Debate. Brooke is currently a PhD student at Baylor University. She received her MA in History from Utah State University and her BS in Psychology from Brigham Young University. She wrote her MA thesis on Elizabeth Pickett Tolman, a 19th century Latter-day Saint plural wife who struggled with infertility. And she also published an article in the Journal of Mormon History in April of 2021 titled, "I Would Not Risk My Salvation to Any Man, Eliza R. Snow's Challenge to Salvific Coverture." She's primarily interested in women and religion in the 19th century, particularly Latter-day Saint women and the practice of plural marriage. Our second speaker is Richard Saunders, and he will present on handling the Gladdenites. Dr. Richard Saunders is an academic librarian and former Dean of Library Services at Southern Utah University. A graduate of Utah State University, he holds graduate degrees in history from USU and the University of Memphis. His career in history has centered on preserving the sources of history as a certified archivist and special collections librarian. But he's also researched and published widely on historical topics, including Yellowstone, the American West, Mormons, American popular literature, and the US Civil Rights Movement. He's presently at work on a biography of historian of Western America, Del L. Morgan, and a study of post-war social and economic change in the rural South. This presentation is an update of part of his 1989 thesis on Francis Gladden Bishop's career and the Mormon Diaspora. At the end of their 20-minute presentations, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. And again, put those questions in the Q&A box below. And Brooke, we're ready for you to begin.
Okay. All right. In the first part of the year 1870, there were two new developments regarding the Mormon question. One, the new Mormon Schism, which became known as the Godbeites, or the New Movement. And two, the Column Bill, a piece of anti-polygamy legislation being debated in Congress. The solution to the Mormon question seemed imminent, but many were unsure if it would be the strong arm of the law exercised through the harsh legislation in the Column Bill, or if the Godbeites, seen as evidence of the inevitability of civilization's modernizing effect, would solve the issue without the necessity of outside intervention. This debate got to the heart of American expectations regarding progress and modernity in 19th century America. Ironically, the Column Bill would never pass, and the Godbeites would eventually fade, both becoming seemingly insignificant in the story of Mormon polygamy and anti-polygamy legislation. Using newspapers, congressional debates, and other published sources, this paper examines a very narrow period of time to explore what the fears, hopes, and expectations of Americans surrounding both of these phenomena reveal about conceptions of modernity, progress, and Protestantism. While most agreed that Mormonism and its practices of polygamy and theocracy needed to be stopped, many differed in how they thought this should happen, what the role of government should be for this end, and even whether outside force was necessary. In 1856, at the First Republican National Convention, the party made it their goal to abolish the twin relics of barbarism, namely Mormon polygamy and slavery. The phrase is indicative in many ways. Labeling polygamy as a relic of barbarism was a way to call it backwards, uncivilized, and unchristian. America was steadily progressing forward into the bright horizon of modernity, and polygamy had no place in modern America. The practice of polygamy was insulting to the moral tendencies of the American people, but many also believed that the power held by Latter-day Saint leaders threatened American democracy. In the congressional debates for the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, signed into effect on the 8th of July, 1862, Justin Morrill argued that, quote, Mormons are quite as hostile to the Republican form of government as they are to the usual forms of Christianity. This violation of the separation of church and state made Utah government thoroughly un-American. Morrill enumerated, this hierarchy is clearly repugnant to the Constitution of the United States. Of course, one of the most incriminating aspects of Utah government was that it was used to, quote, make their patriarchal institutions more homogeneous. Thus, the Mormon problem was more than the practice of polygamy. It was the consolidation of power into the hands of a few, the lack of separation between church and state, and the way that their local government protected polygamy. In short, it was Mormon theocracy. The arguments surrounding the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act reveal that these legislatures saw multiple potential solutions to the Mormon problem. While Morrill proposed legislation and intervention from the federal government, others contended that such legislation was unnecessary. Instead, the Morrill problem would solve itself as Utah became more civilized, with better roads, telegraph wires, and railroads. Representative William Boyce reasoned before the House, quote, the more they become civilized, the less they are Mormons. Historian David Walker describes this belief in the civilizing effect of the railroads as the death knell thesis, explaining, quote, Boyce's prediction was that prosperity and industry would bring civilization. Civilization would bring schism, and schism would bring more opportunities for more development. The Moral Anti-Bigamy Act was passed, but it was unenforceable for two primary reasons. First, it required a Mormon jury to convict a polygamist, and second, it relied on a formal definition of marriage. The timing was also not ideal. The Civil War drew national focus away from Utah and Mormon polygamy. However, by 1870, with slavery abolished, the country was once again ready to devote its attention to polygamy. Most of the men and women who would become leaders in the Godbeite movement were British converts to the Mormon faith who came to Utah during the 1860s. These include William S. Godbey, Elias L.T. Harrison, Thomas P.H. Stenhouse and his wife Fanny Stenhouse, and Edward Tullidge. In Utah, these individuals quickly became successful businessmen, intellectuals, and prominent leaders in the church. Like other church leaders of the time, many of them entered polygamous marriages. However, during the 1860s, they began to question whether Brigham Young was abusing his position as church leader. They disagreed with many of Young's economic policies, arguing that he was blending the lines between religion and the economy. These individuals were also proponents of women's rights and women's suffrage, and involved with the Relief Society organization in Utah. While most Godbeite women would eventually distance themselves from the Relief Society, views of women's roles and women's equality influenced the goals and actions of the Godbeite movement. In the fall of 1868, Godbey and Harrison traveled to New York, reportedly for a business trip. However, a letter from one of Godbey's wives revealed that their real motivation was to, quote, settle the question regarding their doubts of Mormonism. In New York, they met with a spiritualist medium. They claimed to receive messages from Joseph Smith, Heber C. Kimball, and even Jesus Christ himself, who affirmed their suspicion that Brigham Young had strayed from the original foundation established by Smith. They set forth to reform the church. The growing popularity of their ideas among Utah citizens led Mormon leaders to respond. In October 1869, the church held a public trial and excommunicated Godbey and Harrison. With the excommunication, the new movement came out of the shadows and into the public eye. As the new movement was taking shape at the end of 1869, Edward Tullidge sent a letter to the New York Herald. His purpose was both to raise awareness regarding the Godbeite movement, as well as convince readers that the Godbeites were going to transform Mormonism into an acceptable, modern, and Protestant version of Christianity. As historian Tissa Wenger has argued, American governing forces in the 19th century, quote, posited Protestant Christianity as part and parcel of becoming American, the only way to form subjects who could responsibly exercise freedom. This American Protestantism was rooted in the ideals of individualism and disestablishment, two ideals which Mormonism challenged. Tullidge, seemingly aware of both the importance of a religion being accepted as Protestant to be protected in the American plurality of religions, as well as the challenge that Mormonism posed to these ideals, purposely framed the new movement in the terms of Protestant Reformation, all the while arguing that only the new movement could modernize Mormonism. He began with, quote, for the last quarter of a century, the civilized world has been anxiously looking for the solution of the Mormon problem in an acceptable form. For him, the solution was not the strong hand of the government. Quote, the government in hostile intentions could not grapple with the Mormons and their faith. But what of the death knell thesis? Tullidge explained it has been too much expected that the coming up of civilization would explode us, and that the Mormons and their religion would pass away forever in their special character. This is a radical mistake. We have the nation and the railroad around and through the very heart of our localities and situations, yet our people have been reduced to a greater temporal bondage than before. Thus, Tulich argued that neither of the predominant solutions to the Mormon problem, namely government intervention or the civilizing influence of the railroad, would be effective. Rather, his solution of the Mormon problem revolved around the assertion that, quote, religious communities are not changed into better forms of or pressure from without. The Mormons must solve their own problems. Next, he appealed to Americans' Protestant heritage. He explained, we shall find our coming issues in Protestantism and reform. The present phase of Mormonism is easily understood. It is simply popedom and reformation. Tulich gave a brief history of the Mormon Schism thus far and named the leaders as Elias Harrison and William Godbeites. He explained that Harrison, quote, will be known in history as the Mormon Luther. It was the temporal power of the Mormon Church and the lack of spiritual power, which had been absent since the death of Joseph Smith, that Tulich argued was so problematic. He claimed the saints in Utah for nearly 20 years have been entire strangers to their former spiritual power. By emphasizing a return to the spirituality of early Mormonism, Tulich was subtly reinforcing the American Protestant ideal that religion and spirituality must be separate from the economy and politics. This movement, he argued, will change the Mormons and their institutions into acceptable forms and endow them with progressive and universalian genius. There were a few things about this Mormon schism that Tulich felt others would be pleased to learn. Quote, they are loyal and maintain the genius of the United States. They uphold the gospel of love and not of coercive will. They are in favor of universal benevolence and Christianity. They are opposed to a temporal theocracy and the union of church and state. They are decided against the pernicious distinction of Mormon and Gentile and are against all the hatreds of sectarianism. They have nothing to do with hells and devils and damnations. They defend the cause of the working man and encourage the development of the mineral resources of the Rocky Mountains. As historian David Walker explains, the Godbeites believed that Mormonism should support an economy based on individualism and economic liberality. The Godbeite movement eventually, quote, claimed to represent a liberal, laissez-faire, Republican, privatized, and thus properly Protestant brand of Mormonism, fit for secular currency and amenable to American incorporation. Tulich concluded his article by stating, the people of the United States may expect a very warm intellectual warfare in Mormondom. The eyes of the nation are upon us, and it would be unwise for the authorities of Utah to provoke the government to fly to the rescue in the cause of humanity. As it is, I believe that this movement will save the government from the necessity of meddling with the affairs of Utah. Notably, Tulich was not arguing that this reformation must erase the distinctiveness of Mormonism. Prophets, spiritual gifts, and the theology of restoration through Joseph Smith were all aspects of Mormonism which he noted and praised. He saw no contradiction between those aspects of Mormonism and the necessary characteristics of acceptable American versions of Protestantism. Additionally, any mention of polygamy was conspicuously and curiously absent from Tulich's article. Rather, it was the theocracy of Mormonism, the popedom, as he referred to it, that must end. The Cullen Bill, the first anti-polygamy legislation proposed since the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, criminalized polygamy by proposing heavier penalties and requiring less proof. Rather than requiring hard evidence of polygamous marriages, it proposed to imprison anyone who cohabitated with more than one woman or who treated multiple women as wives. It also proposed requiring an oath of loyalty and allowed for dismissal from public offices for supporting polygamy, as well as denied citizenship to foreign-born polygamists. But perhaps most threatening, the bill would authorize the federal marshal to utilize military power for, quote, the execution of any writ, order, process, judgment, or decree. The threat of military power and possibly violent compulsion to enforce this bill both outraged Mormons and gave many non-Mormon Americans pause. Was another civil war really what the country needed at this time? The Godbeites almost immediately began working against the Cullen Bill. William Godbeites traveled to Washington, D.C. to persuade politicians of the, quote, folly and superfluity of the Cullen Bill. The Godbeites had some support in Washington. A few legislatures argued that this new movement was a result of the civilizing effects of the railroad, and that if the government waited rather than intervening now, these civilizing forces would bring about the end of polygamy. Godbeites also met with Representative Shelby Cullom regarding the bill and reportedly convinced him to remove many of the more punitive aspects. Undoubtedly, the fact that several of these Godbeite leaders practiced plural marriage motivated them to try and lessen anti-polygamy legislation. With the effects of the Civil War still very present in the lives of Americans, many were concerned that the harsh legislation of the Cullen Bill would start a war in Utah Territory. Several Nevada newspapers expressed this concern, such as the Elko Independent, which stated, "If it is true that this Cullen Bill is a declaration of war against the Mormon Church, we may soon see lively times in Utah." Additionally, the Cullen Bill was often discussed in context of the Godbeite movement, with concerns that the bill would encourage the schism to rejoin the larger church. The Elko article continued, "This bill will consolidate the Mormons and quickly heal the little differences and breaches which recently appeared on the surface of their society." Other nearby territories expressed similar concerns. The New Northwest, a newspaper based in Deer Lodge City, Montana, published a conversation between a senator and an unnamed tall, sinewy miner on the topic of Mormons and the Cullen Bill. The senator reportedly argued that, quote, "Were we to give them the pretext of war just now, the malcontent and rebellious party, most likely referring to the Godbeites, would be crushed out, and we should have at great expense to do what they would otherwise accomplish for us cheaply and peacefully." The miner then added that while nobody liked Mormonism as a religion or as a moral matter, that, quote, "the reports of atrocities there are always exaggerated and often manufactured. The Mormons had done much good," he explained, "building up a fine city, implementing irrigation and such." He argued we ought occasionally to look over the head of Mormonism, over the head of what Mormonism is to the fact of what it has done. Like Puritanism, Quakerism, and the Baptist fervor, it has answered the purposes of colonization in America. Mormonism thus could be considered an acceptable Protestant religion, albeit a strange one, if it aided the efforts of colonization. This surprisingly informed and opinionated miner concluded by stating, "I have read the Cullen Bill. It is a loose bill. It kills a mouse with a mountain. It is a bad precedent and will work disorder in the territories, retard the speedy extinction of polygamy, and be a help to the domination of Brigham Young. We have driven the Mormons from Kirtland to Nauvoo, from Nauvoo to Missouri and Iowa, and thence to Deseret. Every time we have lengthened the life and power of Mormonism. Give it rest and it will die." Montana, Nevada, and other territories close to Utah were wary of the potential effects of harsh legislation. In places further from Utah, there were disagreements regarding the probability of war. In Philadelphia, an article titled "The Danger of War in Utah" discussed many of these concerns. The article outlined the provisions of the bill and stated, "This bill means war. Its terms and provisions are in the nature of preparations for war. Its execution will assuredly be followed by war." The article reminded its readers of the failure of Johnston's army. It continued, "Cullen's bill provides for the employment of about 40,000 troops, partly regulars and partly volunteers. The Mormons could give such a force 2 or 3 years fighting at an annual expense to us of not less than $200 million. That was a lot of money for a country still reeling with the after effects of the Civil War. Rather, the article concluded, the government should not forcibly interfere with polygamy or Mormonism at all. The pacific forces that are now in action will make it impossible for polygamy to exist for any great length of time. It was the pacifist, moralizing influence of groups like the Godbeites that many believed should be used to undermine polygamy, not violent compulsion. The New York Herald recognized the problems of polygamy, but also expressed sympathy towards the Mormon protests over the Cullen Bill. The article recognized that, quote, "the institution of Mormon polygamy cannot remain much longer in Utah, and that the government had a role to play in its dissolution. Quote, it is then the duty of the government to provide in some way for the removal of Mormon polygamy, but it is also the duty of the government to deal justly and kindly with the Mormons." It concluded, "The Cullen Bill of pains, penalties, and military terrorism is not the thing." Others were not so sure. The Chicago Tribune consistently followed the events surrounding the Cullen Bill and vacillated between expressing concerns that the bill would bring about violence and confidence that the bill would weaken Brigham Young's power in Utah. It did, however, consistently report on the growth of the Godbeite movement. The fears, concerns regarding a possible war in Utah were echoed by the discussions about the bill in Congress. Samuel Cox, a Democratic representative from New York, stated, "I believe this bill has in it the seeds of civil war, or some sort of war, which will be expensive and troublesome. I would strangle polygamy by another process than the hostile persecution provided in this measure." Samuel Axtell, a Democratic representative from California, condemned polygamy, but stated that the Cullen Bill is harsh, unnecessarily so. It is substantially a declaration of war. Opinions about the Godbeites were even more varied than opinions about the Cullen Bill. As early as October 1869, the same month as Godbey and Harrison's excommunication, newspapers outside of Utah began excitedly publishing the news that a Mormon schism had begun. The New York Herald reported, "A serious schism prevails among the Mormon elders in Salt Lake City. Schisms, like revolutions, never go backward, and the schism now fermenting may work a revolution in Utah that will save a great deal of trouble to the nation and bring the territory into the Union as a state much sooner than has heretofore been anticipated." By December, newspapers were already beginning to wonder what the Godbeites' position on plural marriage would be. In January 1870, the same short message was repeated in newspapers throughout the states, that a Mormon schism now had over 2,000 converts. One South Carolina newspaper published about the goals of the new movement's reform, quote, "No dominant priesthood, no more missionaries to be sent abroad, reduction of tithings, abolishment of centralizing power and mercantile cooperative institutions, abolishment of the word Gentile and all civil religious persecutions, advocating the church power to be invested in 12 apostles, and the plural marriages are to be supported only when based on pure affection and refinement, women to be better educated and respected." In February 1870, the Chicago Tribune published an article outlining the railroad in Utah and giving an account of the Godbeite movement. The article explained, "This clinging to the idea of revelation and to the belief and practice of polygamy is about all there is objectionable to the Godby Reformation. They seem to be unable to let these babyisms, if not barbarisms, go, but they must creep before they can walk." The article recognized that the Godbeites' ideas generally fit within a broad ideal of democracy, and happily reported they divorced church and state completely, providing separate and independent machinery for controlling each. Thus, the Godbeites seem to solve at least one of the major Mormon problems, but they cling to polygamy. The article concluded, "Utah must conform to the spirit of the age. The Godbeites are earnestly endeavoring to bring their church into such unison with that spirit as they must and may, and therefore it is that I believe they will succeed." The Godbeites would eventually formally denounce polygamy, but not until July 1871, after the Cullen Bill had stalled in Senate, and after well-known women's suffragists Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton visited the Godbeites in June of 1871 and kindly rebuked them for still practicing polygamy. Less than 2 months after this visit, Godbey gave a speech announcing a revelation that he had received regarding, quote, "the solution of the polygamic problem in Utah." Claiming the equality of woman with man as the reason that polygamy could not continue, he advocated for education for women, for separation from plural spouses only when a wife wanted to, and continued financial support for wife and children by the husband following the divorce. Many saw this speech as evidence that the general practice of polygamy would soon come to an end. The Overland Monthly in California published an article shortly after his speech titled "Plurality of Wives," in which they gave an account of polygamy in Utah and concluded that the practice was coming to an end. They quoted a long section of Godbey's speech and claimed, "For some 10 years past, powerful internal causes have been at work in Utah, slowly but surely undermining the polygamic institution, causes in themselves abundantly sufficient for its final overthrow." The Women's Journal, the voice of the American Women's Suffrage Association, commented on Godbey's speech and concluded that the presence of such ideas as the equality of women and men, quote, "doomed polygamy." In 1873, many still believed that the schism that the Godbeites had created would rid Utah of polygamy. Allen Thurman, the Democratic senator from Ohio, argued before the Senate that, quote, "polygamous marriages in Utah are becoming more and more unpopular with the Mormons themselves. The doctrine of polygamy has already produced a schism in that church, and every person acquainted with the facts in the territory will unite in saying the young generation is more and more opposed to polygamy." In reality, it would take almost 20 more years and the passage of multiple pieces of harsh anti-polygamy legislation before the Mormons would officially stop practicing polygamy. And even then, it would take several more decades before the practice died out among the mainstream church. The Godbeites' influence waned through the 1870s. The Cullen Bill stalled in Senate and never passed. And yet, this moment in 1870, when both seemed so important, reveal important expectations about fears regarding modernity, progress, and the supremacy and ideals of Protestantism in America. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That was a great paper, Brooke. And now we will turn the time over to Richard for his paper. So Richard, you're up.
Good deal. Thank you, and welcome to those who are coming. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to tell the story rather than read for you, because some new information has come up that's been really useful. This is based somewhat on my master's thesis from 1989, a fair bit ago, and a John Whitmer Historical Association journal article that was published in 1996. That's the spot where I explored the social context of heresy, especially in early Utah, and relied very strongly on the letters of Ezra Strong, who was a convert to Gladdenism and actually wrote them shortly after leaving Utah, so that the closest thing we have to firsthand information. However, this presentation has the benefit of some new sources and a maturity of thinking. The presentation in this case is more about religion and the cultural transmission within the diaspora than it is about the social end of things, and there's still room to be worked on. Most importantly, it's informed by the transcriptions made by Legene Carruth, who discovered some really important sources, including Alfred Smith's a recording of Alfred Smith's lecture in the Tabernacle. But let me jump into the presentation. I'll share my screen with you and let you take a look at it. We'll talk a little bit about who Francis Gladden Bishop is and where he came from and why he's a significant character. So, Francis Bishop was one of the children in the Isaac Gates and Marie Hyde Bishop family, who were just outside Rochester, New York. They were among those caught up in the 1819 great excitement on the subject of religion that later attracted Joseph Smith. They were converts of the early 1830s. Both of them, the entire family was converted to the gospel in 1832 in Rochester, just outside Rochester, Greece, New York, just to the west. But before that happened, their son Francis, their second son Francis Gladden Bishop, claimed a series of visions and angelic visitations that he interpreted later to be appointments to some sort of greatness. Now, there's no contemporary record for this. The only thing we have is Bishop's reminiscent account, which tends to be a little colored, I think, in his direction. However, he relied on those things very strongly for a very long time. And I think they really set a pattern for his experiences later in life. Francis, there's Greece, New York. Francis later becomes a missionary. And serves a number of missions all over the Eastern United States. As a matter of fact, to Francis Bishop, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. To Francis Bishop belongs the interesting distinction of having created the first published history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Church of Latter-day Saints at the time, published in 1838 during the height of the Missouri troubles in North Carolina. As a matter of fact, it predates a couple of the other early historical statements of the church by a few months, and it's virtually unknown, exists in a single copy at the Library of Congress, but a fascinating document itself. He was one who had coveted the priesthood and coveted priesthood standing. He sought ordination in a couple of occurrences. After a very checkered history as a missionary, he was excommunicated in Nauvoo in 1842. There's a whole story that goes along with that one that I won't go into. And he spends the next 8 years basically attempting to gather followings from among the Latter-day Saints, most of those who were not in Nauvoo. They were scattered through the Midwest, including an attempt at co-opting James Strang's following in Voorhees, Wisconsin. That's, again, another fascinating story that really needs a little more exploration. Don't have enough time to deal with it today, but it was interesting. By 1850, however, he shows up in let me do this. There's Bishop as a missionary. I'm missing my slides here. By 1850, he shows up in Kirtland, Ohio, which was playing host to a number of very small schismatic claimants. And by 1851, he publishes. Oh, come on. Oh, back up. Let me back up and catch this thing. Bishop put a tremendous amount of faith in his own experience all the way through his career, whether he's in the Latter-day Saint Church or outside the Latter-day Saint Church. He's always harking back to his prior ordinations and his visitations. He was particularly a scriptural literalist, apparently knew the Bible very, very well. Was very much converted to the idea of the Old Testament, and especially to Messiah scriptures in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Zechariah, which is a millenarian book. He draws very heavily on the idea of numerological symbolism. So the numbers of things that are happening become critical for him. And especially in places like Forey, Wisconsin, he stages pageants. I guess that's really the only way to enact important things that he sees in scriptures. Most importantly, however, he's a premillenarian. He's convinced about the idea of his work being focused on preparing for the second coming of a character that he now calls the Ancient of Days, which will come before the coming of Jesus Christ. In Kirtland, Ohio, he publishes a long roll, which is mailed in a roll and is sent to all over to scattered schismatic organizations all over the United States. In April 1851, he publishes these things and sends them off, including about 60 copies, he says, by his own account, sending them to Utah, to people he had known in Nauvoo and earlier in Kirtland. They arrive in the summer of 1851. The Salt Lake Valley had been settled for less than 5 years. It's still very much a growing community. People are flooding in from all over the place. But Bishop writes a former acquaintance of his, a guy by the name of Brigham Young, and says, "I'm sending my new revelation. You need to pay attention to this, and I'm on my way to prepare the Latter-day Saints for the coming of the Ancient of Days." Well, that's really interesting. It gets Brigham Young's attention, and Brigham does exactly nothing about it. Bishop was not someone he regarded very highly. In fact, most people didn't regard Bishop very highly. However, very interestingly enough, within a year, Brigham makes a pronouncement to call the Latter-day Saints out of Western Iowa to make sure that they gather to Utah. And he says, look, you either come and be faithful or you stay there and you're apostates. It's pretty cut and dried at that point. Now, it's interesting because within a little bit of time, you'll start seeing comments that crop up in Latter-day Saint communications that says basically that the ruts of the Oberlin Trail are the boundaries that circumscribe faithful and apostate Latter-day Saints. In other words, to Brigham Young and those who are in Utah, if you don't come west, you're not a faithful saint. That's a little bit problematic because there's a lot of congregations scattered all over the Midwest who are very stable, who are not interested in leaving well-established farms for starting again somewhere in the Great Basin, which is not getting a really good rap at this point. However, the way as it's moving, Bishop also turns around and he publishes a longer pamphlet that explains this thing that he calls the flying roll. And that's significant because that also goes out to Utah. And that begins having some effect. In Utah, there is one of the characters that shows up with this is a woman by the name of Polly Conklin, who shows up at Brigham Young's office and wants to be sealed to a man by the name of John Booth. And for somehow the conversation turns to apostasy and apostates, and Gladden Bishop's name comes up. And Polly Conklin, in front of Brigham Young, says, Bishop is a prophet, we need to listen to him. That doesn't go over very well in Brigham Young's office. Within a few weeks, early 1852, a guy by the name of Alfred Smith, who was an English convert, refuses a proselyting mission. He's called in conference to attend a proselyting mission. He turns it down, and he turns it down at his wife's instance and says, no, I'm not going to do that. And interestingly enough, he is one of the early converts. He and his wife become one of the early converts to Gladdenism in Salt Lake City. Within a few weeks of that, a man by the name of John Gallup begins a conflict with his neighbors over the idea of Gladden Bishop's publications, which apparently have now been circulating at least hand to hand among people in Salt Lake City, which is an interesting arrangement, given that there probably weren't very many people who would have been very open to Bishop's prospects. However, a small group of believers or people who are now trusting these pamphlets. Now, Bishop hasn't come himself. All he's doing is sending publications. A small group of believers begin to coalesce, and they start meeting informally. Meanwhile, Bishop gets as far as Council Bluffs, Iowa, and settles into town. He's trying to make his way to Salt Lake City and doesn't quite make it, but he publishes a third pamphlet, The Ensign Light of Zion, Shepherd of Israel, a Book of Remembrance, from the press there, and again dispatches. That's his contact into the Salt Lake Valley. Now, that's significant because now by this point, Bishop has had 3 publications that have gone west. By August 1852, we start seeing some real challenges in the valley itself. The Gladdenites have begun becoming a little more visible. By August, they're visible enough that Brigham Young invites Alfred Smith to address the saints themselves in the Tabernacle, or in the Bowery, would have been called the New Tabernacle. Now, if you look at this is Salt Lake City in 1853, the closest thing we have to a contemporary view. You can see this is not a big community. There are maybe 6,000 or 7,000 people, not in the valley, but scattered north and south along the Wasatch Front. The community itself is maybe 3,000, 3,800 people. It's not a big community. Right over here is the Tabernacle, and you can see what's going on with the area here. This is the Tabernacle where Smith speaks. You might get a little closer view right here. What's significant about this is that as Smith begins his sermon, and this is again one of the things, thankfully, that to LeJean Cruz, she not only found it, but she transcribed it into English. Smith says a number of things that are really significant. First off, he focuses on Gladden Bishop's claim to 7 sacred things. And the 7 sacred things he lists in the address to the sons and daughters of Zion. At least one of them is the Urim and Thummim that Joseph Smith was supposedly had used to translate the Book of Mormon plates. There are a number of other things, including the sword of Laban, which Gladden Bishop now calls the iron rod, because it was supposedly made out of steel, and Bishop claims to have this kind of stuff. Importantly, he has that the possession of these 7 sacred things is what Smith argues constitutes a prophet. Now that's significant because it reduces prophetic origin or prophetic calling to possession of something that's supposedly objective. Obviously, Francis Bishop has them. Brigham Young does not have them by implication. And so that constitutes Bishop as a prophet, seer, and revelator, and Brigham Young as not a prophet, seer, and revelator. Importantly, the Bishop's flying roll, the proclamation, had had used the at least short-term allegiance of one of the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon, Martin Harris, and Bishop's Flying Roll publishes a description of the gold plates, which Harris goes on record as saying is an accurate rendition of what the plates actually looked like. Now that's significant and interesting by itself. He also quotes the idea of Genesis about Joseph of Egypt, and says what things are to be are prophecy, and sees Francis Bishop and his work as a fulfillment of Joseph's prophecy about his seed. He also says that Lucifer and his followers have taken on bodies and are now present on the earth specifically to deceive the saints and to lead the church away into the wilderness. It's a rambling comment, but it's not much less disjointed than many of the sermons that have been immortalized in the Journal of Discourses. Importantly, he says this: Brother Brigham does not receive revelations or the sacred things because of that prejudice from your minds, and if you are built upon it as if you are built upon eternal truth. If this is a lie, you need not be afraid of it. I'll tell you one thing, that the time is nigh at hand that you must know what foundation you are upon. Gladden Bishop sees this dividing line, and I believe it with all my heart. Now, in a real sense, Smith is wandering all over this subject. It's a kind of a mix of mainstream theology and Bishop's millenarian ideas. The important point is he points that Bishop is setting up the kingdom of God based on his possession of the sacred things, sees both Brigham Young and Joseph Smith as preparers, and he takes Bishop's proclamation directly at face value. Now, Brigham gets up and responds directly. He does it twice in the same day, but only after the sermon, only in the afternoon sermon is recorded in the Journal of Discourses. Legene Caruth's transcription points out that we said, this is Brigham Young's quote, we felt willing to have him have a liberty and privilege here to exhibit his feelings and what he believed with regard to Gladden Bishop. We have seen the rise and fall of many great men. Gladden has risen and fallen 13 times and will not rise anymore. It's not worth talking about it. Now, clearly, Young thought that Bishop was a fool, and based on his prior experience with Bishop directly and his revelations, felt that he had lied in the Lord's name, that it was a false revelation. Importantly, Bishop and Smith and Young all note that claim John the Revelator is the Ancient of Days. Brigham Young follows up eventually by restating that no, the Ancient of Days is Adam. Smith's, and then things kind of go away for a while. Smith has a private proselyting effort through the winter, draws in maybe 30 or 40 people, but social conflict comes to a head in the spring of 1853. Smith posts handbills, probably handwritten, in non-LDS stores, and attempts to preach in early March in a wagon box. In a wagon box that is parked right across the street from the Tabernacle, from the old Tabernacle. Now that's significant because all of a sudden now you have a street confrontation and not just somebody who is talking. That doesn't go over well. On March 27th, Brigham Young stands up and preaches against the Gladdenites, and in this context produces his legendary sermon, which is given as the context for the Adam God theory, or what was become later known as the Adam God theory. Now it's important to recognize that the context for Brigham Young's sermon is not just something that's off the cuff that he's dreaming up. He's specifically answering the Gladdenite thinking and ideas. Unfortunately, Legene has not been able to find the transcript, the shorthand transcript of that sermon. But it's an important sermon, and it also puts the idea into the community that you can respond to these Gladdenites. Brigham Young stands up and says, let this people alone in these valleys of the mountains, or you'll find that which you are not looking for. He tells the bishop specifically not to allow these heretics to speak in their wards. And he talks about the importance of apostates within your midst. What's been the starting point of all your afflictions? he says to the Latter-day Saints, they have begun with apostates in your midst. These disaffected spirits caused others to come in worse than they who would run out and bring all the devils they possibly could. Now, things are getting a little tense. About a week later, a couple of weeks later, Brigham Young is cornered as the governor of Utah Territory by Calvin Siddell and John Gallup over his, on one hand, taking a religious position that you should persecute and deal with apostates, and on the other hand, as governor, to enforce religious liberalism. Brigham Young backs down. He actually backs down. He says he doesn't want to foster persecution of the Gladdenites, but he doesn't want them here either. Now, Gladden Bishop gets words of this back in the East, and he puts together another publication, which is dispatched west, and he says specifically, the people are not called to suffer in Utah, but God would rain down judgment on the Latter-day Saints. And so things kind of dissipate for a while. There's a group of Gladdenites who leave in the summer of 1853. There's some more confrontations that happen, and about 60 people who claim to be followers of Gladden Bishop mostly leave Utah in the summer of 1854, including a former member of the Mormon Battalion, Eli Hewitt. They gather in Council Bluffs. Now, this small kerfuffle provides plenty of fodder. Ferris comments on the Gladdenite Schism in his book on the Latter-day Saints. The wild overstatement is provided by 19th century sensationalist J.H. Beadle, who piles wild overstatement onto rumor to report with wide-eyed solemnity that Gladdenites have been sacrificed in the endowment house. Now, there's something else going on here that I'll get to, and essentially the Gladdenites are the first public instance of heresy or apostasy in Utah. And there are some lessons that I think we can learn from things that we really ought to pay attention to. Now, let me walk through a couple things that I think are significant. Number one, we learned from this business that Young felt pretty secure in his position and in the West. Now that would change with later more serious heterodoxies under, what the other presenter had talked about under William Godbey and the Tulliges, but particularly with the reorganization missionaries and the Smith brothers specifically. Young was in 1853 willing to let a wacko speak because he and the small band offered no threat to orthodoxy. That suggests that the Latter-day Saints are never completely homogeneous, and they're never completely closed to counterclaims. The second thing it teaches us is that the saints in Utah are still very heavily invested with millennialism. They had left the states partially to escape judgments to be poured out on the nation. The Reformation that happens in 1856 is partly a reaction to the Gladdenite Schism and the unpreparedness that some church leaders felt for Jesus' return. It's very clear within a few years that the Civil War is seen as the beginning of judgments to be poured out on the earth. The other thing that's important, or another thing that's important, is that ongoing revelation is a significant factor in diaspora Mormonism. Bishop was only one of many who claimed a direct connection to divinity. And the theology of revelation is only marginally more significant than its availability. It's enough that people are willing to follow those who claim revelations. Another thing, this has been very, very poorly studied, not adequately studied at all yet, and that is the power of the press during the diaspora. Now, part of this is disguised by the fact that many of these small publications, in fact, all of Bishop's publications, are represented by a single known copy of any printed item. Now, the key here is that print challenges the apostles after 1846. They are unable to compete against somebody else's printing press. And so having a printing press is the 19th century equivalent of mass communication, and it gets noticed. And you'll see this in the context of Charles B. Thompson and of William Smith, and certainly of Strang and of Bishop, that the ability to put something printed that claims to be a revelation in people's hands really gets attention. None of these have the social weight of the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants, but all publications collect some sort of distant adherence to those who've been circulated to. Finally, until we move into the reorganization, almost nothing is known of those who left Utah or left Mormonism, and there's a lot. There's quite a few. Virtually nothing has ever been studied about the population, even though there were hundreds who returned east. We really don't have a good idea of why people leave, nor whether it's over doctrine or, as likely, over the economics of settlement and poverty. But the Latter-day Saints trail, the Mormon trail, is not a one-way street. So let me tell you a little bit about Francis Bishop and his going on. Once he collects his small following in Council Bluffs, he organizes the Church of Jesus Christ of the New Jerusalem in June of 1854. And shortly thereafter, he dispatches himself, headed to England, because that's where the converts are coming from. So that's where he's going to attempt as well. He makes it as far as New York City, and his following just literally falls apart. He eventually creeps back westward in the 1860s, first into central Nebraska, and then eventually into Denver, where he writes Brigham Young and says, I'm coming, I'm on my way again. Eventually he gets to Salt Lake City, where he dies of a scarlet fever during a scarlet fever epidemic in 1864. He finally has the last indignity due to him is that he's buried in his sister's family plot, but he's buried in the wrong grave. The final act of being in the wrong place at the right time. There are a few other things, if anybody's interested, on Gladden Bishop. Mostly it's done my writing, and there's plenty of room for other folks to explore this. Gladden Bishop and his work is a fascinating character, but he's only one of many. And I encourage folks, as we work through the diaspora, as we work through restoration studies, that we really pay attention to these small characters, because they tended to have a larger impact than the work that they did themselves. All right, I thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to William, and let's get some talking going.
All right, great. I just want to thank both Brooke and Richard for some fantastic papers today. We're looking at time a little bit. We only have about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to look at some of the questions, and we'll see if we might be able to get through these quickly. First, to Brooke, I'm going to want to ask a question that's kind of closely related to the main theme of your paper, and that is, what became of the Godbeite movement? This is being asked by Jackson Corinta. Jackson says, my understanding is that they are extinct. Do you know if any former Godbeites were absorbed into the RLDS community?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the Godbeites essentially just kind of fizzled out really during the 1870s. And by the end of the 1870s, the leaders were still around, but the organization was not really cohesive anymore. I'm sure that some did join the RLDS Church. I can't think of any names right now. I know that Tullidge, for a while, Edward Tullidge did go over to the RLDS Church, and then he goes back to Mormonism. So anyways, he goes back and forth. But I am sure, like I said, I don't have names or numbers, but I am sure that a number of them did join the RLDS Church.
Great. For Richard, it looks like I have a comment as well as a question. So from Michael Riggs, he says, Richard, I like your use of the term diaspora with regards to the Mormons. I used it in the context of the Cutlerite migration from Iowa to Minnesota in the Scattering of the Saints volume as well. Going to R.J. Adams, and this comes to, there's so many different denominations that have broken off. He asks the questions, are the Gladdenites the same as the Bishopites? And why the middle name instead of last name Bishop?
I haven't any idea, other than in the context of the 1850s and 60s, they show up described as the Gladdenites. I think they may be the same group as the Bishopites, but I'm not positive. It depends on who you're talking about, what source you're looking at.
Okay, great. Brooke, we're going to come back to you. We have a question from William Moore. When the Godbeites left Salt Lake to go back to New York to get some divine information, William Moore asked, do we know who the New York spiritualist was that they met with?
Yes, yeah. So this, the best work that's been done on the Godbeites is Wayward Saints by Ron Walker. He says that the medium who they met with was a man by the name of Charles Foster, who was a renowned medium.
I would be curious to do a follow-up to that, because the spiritualists were actually, as you know, part of, there were certain movements, certain groups within. Do we know if Foster was part of a certain congregation that had a certain outlook or a certain name to distinguish, or was he kind of an independent spiritualist?
That's a great question. I do not know. Ron Walker might talk about that in this book, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
It's a little bit of an unfair question, but I thought I'd pop that in there. All right, so those are the questions that are asked. We still have a couple of minutes, and so I am going to ask, I'm going to come back to Richard, and I'm curious a little bit if there's not really a quick way to answer this, but if you do have a quick answer, when you're talking about the press, and I'm curious, have you looked at in terms of how printed materials circulating back and forth, things like how much circulation there might be between newspapers exchanged between the Salt Lake Valley and other areas, or how long it might take to get that information back and forth?
Actually, yeah, I actually dabble with printed publishing history. The problem is there are absolutely no records that show how widely things go. The only way you can track it is if you can find a squib published from newspaper to newspaper, and tracking those it's individual, and we don't even have maybe half of all of the newspapers published in the United States, and of that, most of them, including the Deseret News, had 4 different editions published in the 1870s. So we really don't know. The problem is that we rely extraordinarily heavily on 2 institutional collections for all of these things that survive: the Library and Archives in Independence, and the LDS Church Historians Library, Church History Library in Salt Lake City. If it doesn't exist there, there's almost no copies of it. In fact, there's no copies of most of this diaspora material that even exists in private hands. It all kind of went into one of those 2 collections in the 1930s and 40s. So if things come up, that's great. There's a lot of missing material that I would dearly like to find. Dale Morgan studied that in the 1940s. And if anybody's interested, his Churches of the Dispersion bibliography is probably the best it's ever been done on that particular period, but there's just way too much stuff we don't have.
Okay, 1 minute left. Real quick question, Brooke. If someone wanted to follow up on the Godbeites, because you shared information, I think a lot of people, if they haven't read about them, this would be new. What would you recommend they read? Yeah,
so like I said, Wayward Saints is probably the most thorough treatment of the Godbeites. However, David Walker's book that was just published 2 years ago, I think, Railroading Religion is what it's called. The Godbeites are not like the main thing that he's talking about, but he talks a lot about how the Godbeites fit within these ideas, the death knell thesis with the railroads. Anyways, so that I would recommend that.
Great, fantastic. Well, I think that's going to bring us to the end of the session. We want to
let me just mention one new book coming.
Yes.
University of Utah Press has got a new book coming out very shortly on scripture among the Mormon diaspora followings. That's coming out probably next year.
All right, fantastic. And with that, we'll end the session. Thank you everyone for coming and attending and listening to these fantastic papers. And thank you so much for the work and research that you've done, Brooke and Richard. We appreciate it very much.
Yes, thank you.
All right, have a great day.